All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Grasslands, Reptiles, and Amphibians of Missouri with Brian Edmond. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this week's webinar. We have an exciting lineup of webinars and masterclasses scheduled through March on a variety of topics, and we're already working on the lineup for April and beyond. So I hope you can join us for more this winter and spring. During today's presentation and Q&A session, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And when Brian is done presenting, Carol will ask him your questions. The webinar is being recorded. The link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned in today's discussion. So to introduce today's speaker, Brian Edmond is a Prairie Foundation board member. He works by day as an IT professional at Missouri State University. Go Bears. Much of his extracurricular work occurs at the intersection of biology and technology. He's an author on the Atlas of Missouri Amphibians and Reptiles and manages websites for several nonprofit organizations, including helping with our Grow Native website and the Missouri Prairie Foundation website. He has a specific interest in native plants, amphibians, reptiles, scientific collections, habitat restoration, conservation issues, and exploring natural areas. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology from the University of Missouri. So without further ado, take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you, Brooke. And as Brooke stated, I'm going to be talking about grassland, amphibians, and reptiles in Missouri. I do want to give you a few disclaimers at the beginning of this. First of all, my primary experience with prairies and reptiles and amphibians in Missouri is primarily in the southern part of the state. I would be very interested in hearing from any of you who have experience elsewhere that differs from what I talk about. I'm very interested in this topic. My experience is just mainly down here. Another disclaimer is that every photo you see of animals in this presentation are animals that can occur on prairies in Missouri. Not all of the photos are taken on prairies. I just had to kind of dip into a lot of different photos to get everything that I wanted for this. So some of them are taken elsewhere. One more thing is that I'm going to be going through some of these slides pretty quickly. I do want you to know that you will have a chance to look at this later in a recording, and we'll also post it online so you can just kind of flip through the presentation and just kind of look at things a little more closely. Some of the things I'll skip over pretty fast, so you may have to look at them later. So the first thing I want to start with is, what is a prairie? And this isn't as easy to answer as you might think that it would be. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to talk about prairies that are native, original, unplowed grasslands with the diversity of plants and animals that you historically find in northern and western Missouri, but also we'll talk about some sand prairies in southeastern Missouri. I do want to say that a lot of biologists consider important habitats that we find in our more forested areas like the Ozarks as grasslands, such as glades, fens, and savannas. And they're not wrong, those are grasslands, but that's not what I'm going to talk about here. Those are specialized habitats that deserve their own talk. So we're going to stick to prairies like this one here is Coin Prairie in Dade County, which is a Prairie Foundation prairie. So this slide's a little silly, but I wanted to put it in here to kind of drive home a point that these are definitely not prairies and not grasslands of any kind. So we have forests and creeks and swamps in here. So we're not talking about these at all. These are those Ozark grasslands that I talked about. Here we have 4 pictures of glades in the Ozarks. And at the bottom right, you have Grasshopper Hollow, which is actually a fen. A fen is just a specialized type of wet prairie. We're not talking about these habitats at all. Instead, we're going to talk about these. These are actual prairies that we have in Missouri. I want to go over them just a little bit to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The first one here is La Petite Gem Prairie in Polk County. Down here is Linden's Prairie in Lawrence County, Stark Family Prairie in Hickory County, and all 3 of these are Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies. And then also Sand Prairie Conservation Area in Scott County. And we'll talk about the sand prairies a little bit later on during this presentation. So these are the prairies that I'm talking about. These prairies that aren't glades and they aren't fens, and they're mainly in Southwest Missouri, and we'll talk about that. I do also want to mention pastures and cultivated fields. Fescue pastures and other types of pastures that are used for hay and livestock forage are grasslands, and they are used by animals and plants, and they can be considered a grassland habitat, and they are a grassland habitat. They are not prairies. And I don't want to get those two confused. I also want to talk about cultivated fields a little bit. Believe it or not, there are animals that use cultivated fields, and we're going to talk about some of those later on. I want to talk a little bit about the pre-settlement prairie map of Missouri. And pre-settlement is just a term that means this is what the landscape looked like prior to European settlement of the area. So for Missouri, that's basically early 1800s and before. And this pre-settlement prairie map, you can see the dark orange areas on the map are where a geographer named Dr. Walter Schrader, who was at the University of Missouri, used a process to map out what prairies look like in the pre-settlement times. And the method that he used to do this is a really fascinating method. And I'm not going to go into it here, but I do encourage you to look into the way that he did it. It's really interesting. But I will say, because of his methodology, this is a conservative estimate of the prairies in Missouri in the early 1800s and before. And so when you look at this map, you can kind of see a couple of things here. First of all, you'll see that most of these prairies are kind of in an area in western Missouri and northern Missouri. There's a few areas down here in what we call the Ozarks, and the Ozarks is just this region right here where I'm circling that is kind of a plateau that's mainly forested and very rocky with clear streams. And some of these glades are also considered kind of prairie areas. And you can see those kind of mapped out here. Mainly what I'm talking about is this area right down here. Dr. Schrader actually, when he did this, used a very conservative method to estimate this. So it was probably a little bit larger than this in some areas for the prairie areas. So I want to talk about ecoregions, and this map here you'll see later on in the presentation is kind of a base map for the distributions for the species that I'm going to be talking about. But ecoregions is just a concept to kind of divide the landscape into natural boundaries, just like you would geopolitical boundaries for states and counties and so forth. But this is a way to divide the natural world up into ecoregions is what we call them. And the level 1 ecoregions is the most basic ecoregions. And there are 15 of these in North America. So you can imagine all the different habitats in North America, and they can be divided into 15 of these level 1 ecoregions. In Missouri, you can see the Great Plains, which is designated in orange on this map. And it starts kind of in Missouri and stretches all the way to the Great Plains, to the Rocky Mountains. The Eastern Temperate Forests stretch all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So these are really large, broad regions. You can see on this that this area here kind of maps out to that same area in the previous slide where most of those historical prairies are. This area down here is the Ozark Plateau that I kind of talked about, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So from level 1 ecoregions, you go down to a level 2 ecoregion, which divides the landscape up a little bit more. Then you go down to a level 3, which divides it even further. And then you get down to level 4, which is the lowest of the ecoregion classification system. In Missouri, there are 28 level 4 ecoregions. In North America, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And this is really busy, and I'm not going to go over this a whole lot, but I do want to point out two things for you here. First of all is the Springfield Plateau region down here, which is in yellow. And it is actually part of the Eastern Temperate Forest or the Ozark Plateau, but historically it was more than 50% prairie. And you'll know that these lines are created by people, scientists who are trying to divide these things. Nature doesn't follow along straight lines. It doesn't follow the rules, and it doesn't read the books. So we have to make this line somewhere. And for lots of different reasons I won't go into here, this Springfield Plateau was included in the Ozark Plateau, but it is really more than 50% prairie. Another thing that we'll point out later is this region up here in the St. Louis region that we'll look at some of the distribution maps actually has a lot of historical prairie in it also, even though it is also part of that forested region. So let's switch and talk about amphibians and reptiles. And I know a lot of you on this talk knows this stuff already, but I know some probably don't and need a little bit of a brief description of what we're talking about. So amphibians include frogs, toads, salamanders, and newts. Reptiles include lizards, snakes, turtles, alligators, and crocodiles. And these groups aren't they're really different, and they're not particularly closely related to each other, but they've kind of been grouped together traditionally and historically and studied together. You might have heard the word herps, Herps is an informal word that kind of groups together amphibians and reptiles in something that's easy to say, kind of rolls off the tongue. It's a lot easier to say in amphibians and reptiles. So I'll kind of be talking about that through this presentation. I'll be using those terms interchangeably. Just to let you know, herps is a term that is derived from the word herpetology, which is just the study of amphibians and reptiles. And we'll go into this more, but I do want to state here that most amphibians and reptiles in Missouri are habitat generalists. That means they can be found in a lot of different habitats, including prairies. There are some specialists that are more only in prairies and grasslands, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. So diving deeper into amphibians, most Missouri amphibians mate and lay their eggs in the water. A tadpole hatches out and it lives in the water for a while, and then it turns into a juvenile frog or toad or salamander, and then it crawls away and lives on land for most of the rest of its life. Amphibians don't have scales or claws, and their skin is typically moist. Because of those limitations, they're often secretive, living underground, near water sources. They come out at night or during rain, so they're more secretive and you're not as likely to find them. I will say that frogs and toads are by far the easiest herps to observe on prairies due to their breeding choruses. So in the spring mainly, and also in the summer, these animals will come out and they'll gather around at their breeding areas, their ponds where they lay their eggs, and the males will have a mating call that they'll call in a chorus to attract females to the pond. So you can go to a prairie or any area and you can hear them calling. Reptiles are hardier than amphibians. They often don't require a connection to water at all. They're often seen out during the day. During the summer, they'll come out at night when it's really warm. Reptiles typically have scales and dry skin. They also have claws, except snakes, of course, don't have claws. Reptiles are ectothermic, which just means that they do not have a way to internally regulate their body temperature. Often they bask to warm up in the sun, and this is a time that we can easily observe them during the day. All lizards and turtles in Missouri lay eggs in a nest on land. About half of Missouri snakes also lay eggs. The other half give birth to live young. So I want to talk about something here that could be a little bit misleading. All animals and plants around the world have both a scientific name and a common name. The scientific name I've left out of this presentation. You can look those up later if you're interested. But the common names can be pretty interesting and sometimes pretty colorful in the way that they're described. And I want to point out several of these that you may see if you look at a list of herps that are found in Missouri. A lot of them have modifiers on them, such as plains, Great Plains, prairie, or western, and so forth. And these can really be misleading. So if you look at like the very first two on this slide that we'll just talk about a little bit later on, the plains spadefoot toad and the Great Plains toad, these species are not found typically on most Missouri prairies, certainly not the ones down in the southern part of the state. So you can look at these and you can think, I'm going to go to a prairie and I'm going to find a Great Plains skink. And that's just not going to happen over most of Missouri. They just barely get into the state. And certainly they're found in grassland habitats in our further west states, just not in Missouri. So just be a little bit careful when you look at these. And as an example for this, I want to point out three of these species. The first is Great Plains rat snake, which is this map right here. And you'll notice that most of these are found in the Ozarks. There's a few that are found in prairie regions, and they're certainly found in prairie regions in Kansas and Oklahoma and further west. But in Missouri, they're mainly found in the Ozarks. Another one is a prairie king snake. These guys are found all over. They're found in prairies up north and out west. They're also found in the Ozarks. They're just everywhere. The prairie lizard is another one that is mainly found in the Ozarks. They do get into prairie regions a little bit. You get out into Kansas and Oklahoma, way out past the Flint Hills, and you can find them out there. And that's kind of where that name prairie lizard comes from. But in Missouri, you have to be a little bit careful with those common names to know that just because they have that common name doesn't mean you can expect to find them on a prairie. This is a list of the common grassland species that I'm going to go over. I'm not going to read this list to you. I just have it in here for reference. We're going to go over all of these further on. The first one I want to talk about is a smallmouth salamander. This is the only salamander I really consider a grassland species in Missouri. They're difficult to detect in grassland habitats because they spend most of their time underground in mammal and crayfish burrows. They come out to breed in February, sometimes March, with a rain or at least with warm weather. And they'll be out just for a day or two. They'll go to the ponds, they'll mate, they'll lay their eggs, and then the adults go back underground. So they're really difficult to find. And when you look at this map here, you can see there's a lot of big blank areas in the prairie region. I have no doubt that they are found in those areas. They're just hard to find, so there's just not a lot of records of them. I do want to point out the distribution map for this too. You'll notice that these guys are found through the prairie areas, a little bit down into the Ozarks, that Springfield Plateau region, the St. Louis region, and also down in southeast Missouri, which is historically bottomland swamp habitat. And a lot of our, what I would consider grassland species in Missouri kind of follow this distribution pattern. And that is that they're not so much just in grasslands as they are not in the Ozarks. So the Ozark Plateau is kind of a specialized habitat that a lot of these animals just don't live in. They can't make a living there. So you've kind of find them around the Ozarks, but not specifically just in grasslands. And we'll see this over and over again in some of the other maps. I do want to point out several of the common grassland frogs and toads. So as I stated earlier, a lot of our amphibians and reptiles in grasslands are actually generalists, which is just a term that means that they're found all over. So everything that you see on this slide here is found pretty much across the entire state, including the Ozarks, northern Missouri, western Missouri prairies, and everywhere. So I want to go over these just a little bit at a time. And you're probably familiar with lots of these from wherever you live in the state. You've seen these animals probably around pretty commonly. The first one's a spring peeper, which is an early spring breeder. American toad right here. Down here's a video we're going to look at in a minute, and then some American toad egg mass. A couple of cricket frogs, a southern leopard frog with a southern leopard frog egg mass, and then a bullfrog. So these guys, as I mentioned earlier, do have these calls that you can hear on the prairies. And I'm going to play some of these, and I hope the sound comes through okay. And even if it doesn't, you can check them out later. But let's listen first to the spring peeper. And anybody who listens out early in the spring will probably recognize this sound. So that's a sound probably a lot of you recognize. It's one that I'm looking forward to hearing very soon. And these others I'm not going to go over right now, but you'll hear the peeper in this next video, which is an American toad calling. There's only thing calling in the video are American toads and peepers. So let's listen to the American toad and watch him. So, and that goes on. So they can go a long time, and they have that beautiful musical call that you can hear early in the spring, often with peepers, sometimes earlier than peepers. So I want to move on to what I would consider truly a grassland species. And this is the Boreal chorus frog. And you may know this as the upland chorus frog or other names. They can be found in grassy pools throughout northern and western Missouri. And there's also different species that are similar that are found in southeast Missouri. And these guys have a different kind of call. They're related to peepers. They're about the same size. They call about the same time. And we'll listen to a video of those in a minute. But I do want to point out one of these ponds that's on one of our prairies right here. And you'll look at that and you think, wow, that doesn't look like much of a pond. And it's not one that has any fish in it. And in fact, it's not permanent. It actually dries out every summer. And this is a perfect breeding habitat for most of our amphibians, because what they want is a place that they can get in to breed, lay their eggs, get out, and then their tadpoles will live in that pond for a couple of months, 3 months maybe. Then they'll transform and they'll get out of the water. The reason that they like these temporary pools is when they dry out, that clears out all the predators. So these guys can live in those areas very well. In fact, permanent water isn't as good for a lot of amphibians because of that, because they have those predators in them. So in this very pond, actually, I actually made a video of this Boreal chorus frog calling. And I want to play it for you right now, so you can kind of listen to that call, what it sounds like, and watch this guy calling in the pond. And that goes on for a little bit, but this is one of the best chorus frog ponds I'd ever found in Missouri. And that's all that was calling there. And I do want to point out, you can see on the video where I stopped it, is this a little guy right here. And I think, I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that that's what you call a satellite male. And satellite males is something that's documented in a lot of frog species. And what they do is they kind of hang out in the shadows and right near a calling male. And they kind of wait for that female to come by to that calling male and they grab a hold of her. So it's a way for them to get in on the action without expending the energy to call and without exposing themselves to predators by actually calling. I'm pretty sure that's a satellite male. So that's kind of something interesting that, that I observed while we were out there. So another species that I would consider a grassland species is called the plains leopard frog. And they're related to the southern leopard frog that we saw in an earlier slide. They're mainly found in that northern and western part of the state in those historically prairie areas. They also have made their way down the Mississippi River, probably in response to the habitat alterations, removing that bottomland forest, turning it into fields, making a place where they can actually make a living. The next species I want to talk about is the northern crawfish frog. And these guys are actually prairie specialists. They depend on high quality prairie habitats with robust crayfish populations. They actually live in the crayfish burrows. And if you look at the map for these guys, you can see that they're scattered mainly in western and also some in northern Missouri. I will point out that these are all records, including historical records for this species. It is not as commonly found across the state as what this map indicates, because when those prairies go, the frogs go. The crayfish leave when the prairies are plowed under. The crayfish can't make a living there, and the frogs also can't make a living there. These guys have a really brief breeding period, usually starts in February or March. They're easily recognized by their loud snoring calls. There's no other call in Missouri like this. I do have a sound for this. I'm going to play on it. There's also peepers calling in here too, and a couple of other species. But at the very beginning, you can hear this guy calling. It is such a distinctive, neat call. So let's listen to that real quick. If you hear that guy calling, you have some good prairie nearby. So I want to move into our first lizards. And in Missouri, at least, lizards are not commonly found on prairies, but there's a couple of them I do want to talk about. The first one is the western slender glass lizard. And this is actually a lizard. It looks like a snake. It has no legs. And it is actually a lizard that is found throughout most of Missouri, mainly in the Ozarks and other areas, but also in our grasslands. And they are fairly common on grasslands. In fact, if somebody said, hey, Brian, I want you to go out and find a glass lizard today, I would immediately head west to our prairie areas over in the southwest part of the state. Prairie skinks are another one that just barely gets into Missouri. This is one that the name actually does match pretty well, and it does match for Missouri. There are two different subspecies of prairie skinks. There's a northern and a southern, and we actually have them both in Missouri. The northern is found in several localities in the northwest part of the state. The southern, which is in the middle of the screen, is found only in one locality, basically in the southwest part of the state. These definitely are found in prairies in Missouri, also in Kansas and Oklahoma. Now I want to talk more about some common grassland snakes. And like we looked at some of those maps before and talked about it, these guys are all the ones I would consider habitat generalists. They can be found in a lot of different areas, but they are also commonly found on our prairies. So let's go over these one at a time. First is a common garter snake, and these guys are really variable. This one is a red checkered phase of it, but they also come in striped forms and kind of a greenish form and some other variations. Ribbon snakes are related to garter snakes. They're very similar. Green snakes are actually pretty common in the Ozarks, pretty much all over southern Missouri, and they're more of an arboreal species, which it sounds kind of weird to think about them being on prairies, but they're there. They use the shrubs and the scattered tree habitats you find in our grasslands. Western rat snakes are common throughout most of the state. This is one that you may know as a black snake or a black rat snake. A plain-bellied water snake is a water snake that's found. It's another one that has these distributions where it's basically found everywhere except the Ozarks, so it's kind of all over. Racers are found in prairies and pretty much all over. Prairie king snakes, we saw the map about them on them earlier. They're found in prairies, and also speckled king snakes. Let's get into some prairie specialists. And bull snakes is the first one I want to talk about. And this is really a wonderful species of snake. It's the largest snake we have in Missouri. And they are definitely grassland species. And in Missouri, they persist in areas that were historical prairie, but have been converted to various agricultural uses. You can see on the map that they are found pretty much all over western Missouri. They're also found in several places in northern Missouri, around the St. Louis region and in the Springfield Plateau. Around the St. Louis region, I'm not sure they're around there anymore, but we'll see the St. Louis region having a lot of those areas coming up. And the reason there are so many records in the St. Louis region is that St. Louis was a center for science and exploration at the first part of settlement. And so when scientists from the St. Louis region went out to some of these areas to see what they could find, they ended up finding a lot of animals and plants that are now gone from that region because they were able to get there quicker. A lot of other places in the state that we'll look at those a little bit later, they weren't able to get to those places for the prairies were plowed under, and all the animals and plants depending on them were actually gone. Bull snakes are still around. They are definitely a grassland species that you can find in a lot of different areas in the state still. Lion snakes are a weird little species that is more common in the states to our west. They're found scattered in prairie areas in northern Missouri and also in the northern Ozarks. You come across these guys every once in a while. They're really secretive, but you don't see them a lot. These are actually very closely related to garter snakes. Graham's crawfish snake is another one that is mainly, it's a highly specialized predator of crawfish, so it's going to be where the crawfish are. That typically is in wet prairies in northern and western Missouri, but can also be found in the forested areas along big rivers and other places. So now let's switch and talk about turtles. So these are the common grassland turtles that you can find in our prairies. And like the other slides that we looked at several on a slide, these guys are found all over. They're not just in grasslands and prairies. The first one I want to talk about is the three-toed box turtle. And that are these two pictures right here. And this one actually has a fairly typical carapace pattern. The carapace is the upper part of the shell. And the pattern on most of our three-toed box turtles, or a lot of our three-toed box turtles in Missouri, is really plain. Sometimes it's greenish, sometimes it's brownish, but it doesn't have a lot of pattern on it. The plastron, or the lower shell, is unmarked in three-toed box turtles. This one's a little bit tricky. I put this one out here. This is actually a three-toed box turtle. A lot of people look at this and call it an ornate box turtle, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's not. It is actually a three-toed box turtle. A lot of three-toeds in Missouri have these markings on them, kind of tricking you into thinking they're ornates. There's a couple of ways you can tell on this. The first one is you can see the plastron, or the lower shell, is unmarked. And also there's this bony ridge that runs across the carapace. Ornate box turtles do not have that. So if you have that on there, you have a three-toed box turtle. These guys do hybridize. Ornates and three-toeds do hybridize sometimes, and that ends up with a mix of characteristics. In that case, all bets are off. But typically, if it has this bony ridge and no pattern on the plastron, it is a three-toed box turtle. So watch out for that. Another one is a western painted turtle. These painted turtles are another one of those species that just kind of shuns the Ozarks, but they're found pretty much everywhere else. They are in these prairie areas, and you can see that plastron, that lower shell, is really beautiful in these guys, and that's where they get their name. And these guys are, when they get larger, they often lose that pattern, and they just end up being all brown or reddish brown underneath when they're large. These two photos down here are snapping turtles. Snapping turtles are found throughout the state. They're one of our most generalist turtles species. They can be found just pretty much anywhere. And then at the bottom right are red-eared sliders, which can also be found mainly in the southern part of the state, but they're also found in grasslands and more permanent water. A couple of species I want to talk about that are what I consider grassland species. The first one is the ornate box turtle, which we mentioned before. These guys are similar to bull snakes in that they're found in historical prairie areas, but they persist. they are able to survive in areas that have been converted to various agricultural uses. And I included just a lot of different photos in here to show you the variation in their patterns. These guys are just truly beautiful animals, and I'm always thrilled to find them when I see them. Even in our most prairie areas, at least in the southern part of the state, three-toed box turtles are still more common. They're the more common species found, but this one you can find in a lot of different areas. I have found these guys in forests a few times, but never very far from an open area that's a grassland of some kind, whether that be a pasture or a prairie of some kind. These guys tend to come out a little bit later than three-toed box turtles. So three-toed box turtles you can find in March and April, and then onward throughout the spring and summer. These guys typically don't start coming out until later in April and into May. So they definitely have a higher thermal tolerance where they like to come out when it's warmer. The last turtle I want to talk about that's a prairie species are yellow mud turtles. Yellow mud turtles are sort of enigmatic for Missouri. They were historically found in 3 areas: Northeast Missouri along the Mississippi River, around the Kansas City region, primarily along the Missouri River, and then also in Southwest Missouri and some of our prairies in that Springfield Plateau region. There have been a few recent records of these guys, but most of these records are pretty historical. They're pretty secretive turtles and they're not encountered often. So it could be that they're just not around anymore. It could be that there's little pockets of them here and there. These guys tend to be kind of the closest to between an aquatic and terrestrial turtle. They'll use some of these small prairie pools and they'll act like an aquatic turtle in them. But then when those prairie pools dry up, they'll crawl out and they'll find a place to spend the summer underground or whatever they do. But they're kind of in between an aquatic and a terrestrial turtle. So I want to talk a little bit about obligate prairie species, and the word obligate is used to specify a species, could be an amphibian, reptile, plant, insect, whatever, that has to have a specific habitat to survive. So what we had talked about before are these generalist species that can survive in a lot of different habitats. Obligate species are ones that have to have that one specific habitat. So we talked about bullsnakes and ornate box turtles. They're both grassland species. They are both prairie species. There's no doubt about it, but you would not consider them obligate prairie species because they can survive outside of intact prairie. The crawfish frog, on the other hand, is an obligate prairie species. It is found only in intact prairies. When the prairies go, the crawfish frogs grow. So that's one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about here is once the prairies is gone, then the species that depend on that, whether that be a reptile, amphibian, insect, plant, whatever, then they disappear. So those species that are obligates typically are rare or uncommon or what we consider extirpated. And extirpated is a term that means extinct in an area. So extinct means they're gone everywhere. Extirpated means they're gone from a specific place. And we'll use that term a couple times when we go forward to the next few slides. And I want to point this out because we've talked a lot about these habitat generalists that can survive in a lot of different areas, and they seem to be doing well. But there are some species that rely on that intact prairie, that intact habitat, whatever it is, to survive. And that, of course, protecting prairies is the mission of the Missouri Prairie Foundation and why I'm talking about it today. So let's go over a few other species that aren't as common and they aren't as easily observed. The first one I want to talk about, or the first set I want to talk about, are these northern Missouri prairie species. So northern Missouri is a little bit different than the southwest part of the state where I've mainly been talking about. In northern Missouri, that landscape was glaciated about 500,000 years ago. And glaciated just means the glaciers moved down over the state and scraped away all the existing geology and kind of laid down a bunch of really rich soil. And because of that, most of the northern part of the state has been converted to row crop use. That soil is so rich and so good for crops that it was mainly all converted. So what you have is the species that kind of depended on that more northern part of the state for that prairie are mostly gone. And this is 3 of those species that I want to talk about. On the left is a smooth green snake. And these guys haven't been found in Missouri for 50 years. And I hold out hope that there will be populations of them found here or there, but it's pretty unlikely. The plains garter snake is another one of these species that is around still, but it kind of depends on those wet prairies that have mainly been converted. It's, of all these 3 species, it's probably the one that's doing the best. And then the Massasauga on the right here, there's actually 2 different species of this in the state that but are both in the same situation where they're just pretty much gone. They just exist in a few places, and they're just not around very much. I would consider all 3 of these species to be obligate prairie species. Here's a distribution maps for these. This is in the same order as the photos: smooth green snake, plains garter snake, and Massasauga. And Massasauga is actually a type of rattlesnake. I meant to mention that. A prairie rattlesnake is what some people call them. Well, that applies to a different species out further west. But what I do want to point out here are a couple of things. First of all, these guys are not found in a lot of areas in the northern part of the state, but I would bet you that historically they were a lot more widely distributed out here. What's happened here is that these prairie areas were converted to agriculture faster than scientists could get into these areas and kind of explore and look for them. And that's the reason, again, you see this activity around the St. Louis region. It's not that the St. Louis region was particularly great for these species. It's just that they were close enough to the early scientists in that region to be documented in these areas before the prairies disappeared. I don't believe any plains garter snakes might still be around in this area, but the other 2 are not found in the St. Louis region anymore. Another one we mentioned earlier is the Southwest Missouri sand prairie species. And sand prairies are another specialized prairie habitat that we saw a picture of earlier on. And I would consider these 3 species obligate sand prairie species. The first one is the eastern spadefoot. The next is the Illinois chorus frog, which is a little chorus frog that's found in sand prairies in southeast Missouri and also in a few areas in Illinois. It's the only places where it's found. And this dusty hognose snake is also one of these that's only found in a few places. Here's the maps for these guys. So you'll see the eastern spadefoots just down in the southeast part, mainly in these sand prairie areas. Illinois chorus frog, pretty much the same distribution. These 2 guys can kind of get along in those cultivated fields. All they need is a pond or a little ditch for them to breed in, and a place where they can dig into soft soil, loose soil for the summer and the winter. And the dusty hognose snakes is found just in a few places down in the southeast part of the state. I do want to mention one other thing that about a couple of 3 other toad species that are found in Missouri: the Great Plains toad, the Woodhouse's toad, and the plains spadefoot toad. So we have a couple of these prairie common names that we talked about. These guys historically are found in northwest Missouri and also in states further to our west as well. But I do want to point out that all of them have also made their way down the Missouri River, and they're only found in that area. And it's believed that historically, these guys probably washed down with floods in the Missouri River and got down into, in pre-settlement times, they would find forested bottomland and not very much habitat for them to live, and probably didn't do so great. But once we started converting those bottomland forests to fields, all of a sudden they had a place that they could stake out a place to make a living. So again, like the other frogs that we just talked about, all these guys need is a ditch that holds water for a month or 2 and a place that they can dig into loose soil to spend the summer and the winter, and they're in business. So it's believed that these guys probably washed down the Missouri River and set up shop historically, like within the last 100 years. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's kind of happened recently with prairie species that you don't think about being actually in prairie habitats. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about finding herps in prairies. So a lot of people who go out and look for herps, and we call these guys herpers, they may go out and they may look for fun, they may look for science or whatever reason. They go into some of these areas that have rocks or logs or even trash to turn over. And these animals are inactive a lot of the day, and they'll use this cover to hide out. So it's easy to go out to some of these places that have these rocks and logs and trash, turn them over, find the animals, and then you're in business. In prairies, like the picture here on the right, that's a little bit more difficult because a lot of prairies don't have cover at all. Some prairies have rocks in them, but a lot of them don't. So if you're lucky enough to see a snake or a lizard or even a turtle, it can disappear fairly easily in this cover, and you may just get a glimpse of it and that's it. In some cases you can place cover boards, but usually we're just lucky if we get a glimpse of something that's basking. So it really is a bit of a challenge to get out here and find these guys out in prairies. So here's a couple tips for you to figure out what you can do out on our prairie, our Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies. One of the things, you can search burn landscapes on sunny days, even as early as February or March and into April a little bit. And these burned areas typically are complete, the growth from the last year is completely gone. And you can go out and you can find animals that are basking at the entrance to their burrows early in the spring. And you can see them, of course, because there's no vegetation. And as the vegetation grows, and it becomes harder and harder to see them. But that's one way that you can go out and find animals early in the spring. Another way that we've already mentioned is you can listen for frogs and toads calling. And often when you hear them calling, you can use the sound of their chorus to find the place where they're calling. And that ends up being great habitat for other herps as well. So you may find turtles there, you may find snakes that are there hunting for the frogs that are calling. So that's two ways that you can kind of get out and enjoy our prairies. Recently, we've started a project to document all of our sightings on our Prairie Foundation prairies with an app called iNaturalist. And iNaturalist basically is just a way for you to document what you see with a photograph. And even if you don't know what you see, you can put it out there and we can get on there and help you figure out what it is. What I would encourage you to do, if you are on a Prairie Foundation prairie and you see a herp, get a picture of it, put it on iNaturalist or send it to us so we can help identify it. We have species lists for a lot of our prairies, but honestly, all of the listed animals that we have are just opportunistic sightings. We go out to a prairie, we see it, and we document it that way. There's no real way to get out and look for them any other way on our prairies. So I want to switch gears again. I know there's a lot of people on this webinar, or at least on past webinars, who actually maintain their own prairie habitat or their own native restorations. And I want to talk about management of those areas as it relates to reptiles and amphibians. So first I want to talk about pesticides. So pesticides are chemicals. It's a general term that includes herbicides, which kill plants, insecticides, which kill insects and can actually harm other animals and are a little bit dangerous for humans, and fungicide, which kills fungus. So most herps in Missouri are carnivores. Therefore, insecticides, which kill insects, will affect them by killing their food source. In general, if you are restoring a habitat for biodiversity, so if you're pulling up native plants and you want native animals to be there, you shouldn't be using insecticides. That's just not a great idea at all. Herbicides are a little bit different because we have a lot of invasive plant species that need to be managed in our prairie habitats. So in order to minimize your impact on herps using herbicides, you should use them very sparingly in spot spraying applications, and preferably outside of the dormant season if it's possible. It's not always possible. Reptiles are fairly hardy against chemicals in general, but amphibians can be adversely affected by herbicides in a couple different ways. Their skin's moist and they take up environmental toxins readily. So they can take up those poisons and can affect them in lots of different ways. And also the surfactants that are found in herbicides affect their ability to regulate the water loss. So it can actually affect them in that way. If you read the label and follow instructions, which you'd always do using any kind of pesticide, then you will know that a lot of herbicides especially have surfactants in them, and that makes them prohibited to use near water, which can also affect the animals that live near the water. Controlled burning is something that we often do on our native landscapes, forests included. In order to minimize the effects of controlled burning on herps, you should only burn during the dormant season. The dormant season is considered the non-growing season in Missouri that starts in mid to late November and ends in early to mid-February. If you're in northern Missouri, that may be a week or two on either side of that boundary, but you should really monitor local conditions. If you're still seeing active herps in November, it's probably too early to burn. Occasionally we'll have a fall where it stays warm for longer than normal, and you'll see snakes and turtles out active even into November. If you hear frogs calling in the spring, it might be too late. Or if you see reptiles basking, it might be too late. The only thing that can save you on that is if you have a cold spell of several days where it kind of drives them back underground and kind of drives them back into hibernation again, then you may be able to get a burn off. But I will tell you that you'll see typically in a lot of places, including a lot of land areas in Missouri, and also further to our west in the prairie regions. There's a lot of burning that happens in March and April, sometimes even into May. And this is definitely detrimental to the herp species that are there. This is one of the most vulnerable times for many of our herp species because they're just now emerging from their winter hibernation. It's often not very warm on these days, so they are not moving very fast, and it's hard for them to escape. Definitely, if you burn anytime during the growing season, you'll kill herps when you do that. Mowing kills herps either from the blade itself, just cutting up the animals, or from crushing them under tires. If you're mowing just to knock down trees and shrubs, do it during the dormant season. That's an easy thing to do. The herps are all inactive and hiding for the winter. And in order to kill the trees and shrubs, it doesn't matter when you mow, as long as you get them knocked down. If you have to mow during the growing season for hay or to keep a site looking manicured, then the best time to mow is when it's hot. And the reason for this is that any herps they're typically inactive, they're hiding from the sun because a hot day is too hot for most of them in Missouri, but they'll be warmed up. And if they escape, if they need to get away, they're warm enough that they can get away easily, and you won't actually kill them that way, or less likely to kill them that way. If it's possible, it's best to have an area that's a refuge that you don't mow. And when you mow, do it in a way that you mow towards the refuge. So whatever you scare up has a chance to get away, and it gets away to a place where it can actually hide and survive. Grazing is kind of the last management thing that I want to talk about. Typically, grazing animals aren't going to harm herps. They can get along fine, but you have to be careful not to graze a pasture or prairie all the way down to the ground. If you do that, that removes the habitat and the cover. These animals have to hide from predators in the cover, and they also have to hide from the sun on really hot days. They have to get in the shade because they can overheat pretty easily. If you have a situation like this, fence your animals out of ponds and streams to allow the herps there to live in the water, and also include a buffer area between water and land for turtles to nest and for amphibians to live and for snakes to hang out and so forth. If you have structural areas like brush piles or a grove of trees or something like that in your pasture, it's really best to leave those as cover for herps. But obviously don't, if you have a great, beautiful prairie area, don't plant trees in it just for cover. If it's a regular prairie, the animals will do fine there on their own. The last thing I want to talk about is herping etiquette. And remember, we talked earlier about herpers, people who like to go out and find herps out in the wild. And the etiquette part is just a way to do this safely for yourself and for the animals and to protect the habitat. And I kind of adapted these from a list made by a group called Midwest Park. And Park is Partnership for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And they have a whole document that lists these things out for you to look at, and I'll link to it later in the presentation. But the main things that they talk about for this are know the laws, protect the animals, protect the habitat, protect yourself and others, and also be a good liaison between the herper community and the public, and also the scientific community. So I'm just going to go over a few of these. The ones that they have on their website are much more comprehensive, and I encourage you to go out and read these if you go out and find herps out in the wild. The first one I want to state is that state laws actually allow citizens of Missouri to keep up to 5 native herps as pets, but removing animals from public land without a permit is against the law. And this includes Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies. So leave the animals out there. They belong on the landscape in those areas, and you should leave them. All animals should be handled with care, or better yet, just left alone and admired from a distance. So if you just want to keep them out in the wild and take pictures of them, that's great. If you do handle them, just be careful with them, be gentle. Be safe and smart. Don't handle venomous snakes. There's just no reason to do it. Admire them from a distance. Also, amphibians have toxins that can cause skin irritation, especially around your eyes and your mouth and your nose. So be aware of that. And the reverse is also true in that amphibians can also, because of their moist skin, can take up toxins that might be on your hand, like sunscreen, lotion, other things that you might have touched or interacted with. So just be careful with that and just minimize your handling of them. Always replace your cover to the exact position you found it. If you happen to be in a place where there's rocks or logs or even trash, these animals, that's their home. They depend on that cover to live. So if you lift that up and you move it and it's permanently moved, then their home is just permanently disrupted. So if you do happen to do that, then move that cover back. Also, don't vandalize habitat looking for herps. What this means is that there's stories about people who take crowbars out onto these rocky glades and so forth, and they pry apart rocks looking for herps. That's against the law. It's vandalism. Please don't do that. It's not worth it. Report your finds to legitimate authorities. So what I mean by that is if you find an uncommon species, or if you find species on any of our prairies, or if you find something that's out of range, or one of these rare species that I talked about earlier, report it to authorities so that we can know about the population and monitor it. And I'll show you how to do that later on in this presentation. But on the same token, don't share your favorite localities on social media or in other public spaces. There are unscrupulous people who love to go out to these places and collect these snakes and turtles, especially for the pet trade and for other reasons. And if you share your locations, then it's very likely that people will find them and use that information to go out and do bad things. So please don't do that. Finally, if you do see somebody doing something that's against the law or something that shouldn't be done, then contact your local conservation agent and let them know what's going on so they can take care of it. So with that, I have a few things that I have listed here that I'll let you go through to look at later, including that etiquette site and also the Prairie Foundation site that you can look at. So with that, I am happy to take any questions. I really appreciate you coming out and listening to something that is very near and dear to my heart. And I will leave it at that.
Brian,
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. My name is Carol David. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and we do have a number of questions that have been submitted, and so I will get through as many of those as I can, Brian, and you just let us know when your time is running out, but hopefully we can get through quite a few of these questions.
Sure, I'm ready. I'm here for as long as you need me.
Okay, great. One question is about the distribution maps that you used in your presentation, how they were overlaid with the ecoregions. Is that from the Missouri Herp Atlas, or can you explain where those data are from?
Yeah, so that's the Missouri Herpetological Atlas, which is something that I'm involved in. And if you actually go out to that site, you can look at the species that are, all the species that are found in Missouri, and you can look at a number of overlays for all of those species. And one of them is the maps that I included in here. You can also look at them on an overlay of watersheds and just a regular county map and all of the different ecoregion levels.
Thank you. And the references that you provided on the slide that we're seeing now, we will include those in an email out to everyone tomorrow. So folks, you don't have to scribble those down. We'll get those out to you in an email, or certainly write them down now if you'd like as well. Question from Jill about what can homeowners do to help? She's in the Chicago area. She has a hibernating toad in her yard right now, and she wants to make a nice home for it in the spring. And there's another question about what a garter snake might find to eat in someone's yard. So could you talk about optimizing habitat at home for amphibians and reptiles?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think in general, the more native plants that you have around your house or on your property, the better off you are. And the reason is that, as we talked about, most of our herps, not all of them, but most of them are predators. So they depend on animals to eat. And where do animals get their food? At some level, they get it from the plants. And as if you're familiar with native plants at all, you know that native plants support a vast array of caterpillars and other animals, and then those caterpillars turn into insects of various sorts, and all of those are potential food for toads, garter snakes, and other animals. So the best thing you can do is provide cover for them and native plants for them to help them survive. As I talked about earlier, mowing is kind of a death knell for herps. Even if you follow those guidelines that I stated, you're going to kill some of them sometimes. So the less disturbance that you can have wherever you are, the better off it is, the more friendly it is for herps to live in.
Thank you, Brian. We had some questions about specific species, and I'll try to get through as many of these as we can. You talked about the rough green snake and about how it's arboreal. Are there other snakes that are, that might not spend all their time in trees, but that do, climb in shrubs and trees. Can you talk about that a little bit? Sure.
So there's a lot of species will climb. The only other one that I can think of that is a regular climber is that black rat snake. They often will climb high into trees to raid bird nests and probably squirrel nests and other things. A lot of snakes will use trees and low shrubs to kind of get up into to escape. Predators are sometimes to look for prey, but those are the only two that I can think of that are regularly arboreal.
Thank you. There was a question about, are there different varieties of bull snakes? This is Deborah from in Kansas, I think, and she was commenting that the photo that you showed, Brian, looks quite a bit different from bull snakes that she's familiar with.
Yeah, so they're pretty variable. I think the one was from Missouri, the other one was from Kansas on that slide. And they're actually, bull snakes are found in some form or another over most of the US. When you get far out west, they look a little bit different. They're called gopher snakes. When you get to the southeast, they look a little bit different still, and they're called pine snakes. And some of them are different species or whatnot, but they're found over quite a few areas, and they're pretty variable, so that they can look pretty different. I think the species that's found in Missouri and Kansas is the same, so it's probably just variation in their pattern.
Thank you. Few other questions. I may not be asking all these questions in order, but I'll just try to get the kind of jumping from topic to topic. But again, a question kind of about these animals close to home. I have toads in my basement windowsills. Are they captive there? Will they starve? Should I move them out and cover the window wells? Oh, the window wells, and they're in her window wells. So
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So they're in the window wells outside, but they're apparently, she's concerned are they trapped in there?
Sure. So yeah, toads in most window wells that I can think of would be trapped in there, and other small animals might be too. The way you can fix that is just like put a little board or something that sits at the bottom of the window well that kind of leads out, so they can kind of use it to kind of get out. It's possible that they can make a living down there if there's enough things that kind of fall in there. But it's better if you just allow them a way to get out.
Thank you. There's a question about what snakes eat. Do they eat mosquitoes? Do they eat other bugs? Can you talk about their diet, maybe rodents? And I'm sure it varies, but could you speak about this a bit?
Sure. So snakes, they eat all kinds of different things. So it depends on the species. Some of the smaller snakes eat worms and small insects. Other ones, and I'm thinking specifically of like ringneck snakes, which we didn't talk about here, or little brown snakes, which again, we didn't talk about. I think green snakes are primarily insect eaters. Rat snakes, like we talked about, eat birds and mammals primarily. Garter snakes mainly eat frogs and insects, but they'll eat other things too. If they can get a hold of them. There's a few that are specialist predators, but a lot of the snakes eat a lot of different things. Prairie king snakes, which you're looking at here, eat small mammals primarily, but they may also eat other snakes even, or lizards, or birds if they can catch them out on the ground, or just a lot of different things. So there's a lot of variation in that.
Thank you. It's a question, you talked about pesticides and their effects. There's a couple questions about mosquito sprays. How harmful are mosquito sprays to amphibians and reptiles?
Yeah, so that's something I don't know a lot about. My gut reaction on it is that it's probably not great for any amphibian tadpoles that are living in water where the mosquitoes live. I would also say that mosquito larvae are going to be food items, especially for like salamander tadpoles that live in some of those aquatic areas. So I'd probably have to give that a bad mark.
Okay. A question about iNaturalist. You spoke about not sharing locations of amphibians and reptiles on social media. When posting something on iNaturalist, should exact locations be noted, or should they be hidden? Should they, would they be obscured and changed by moderators? And I know we've spoken about this within MPF. Can you speak about that, Brian?
Yeah, I think Brooke can probably answer that question better, but I think the way that we had decided to do that was to obscure the location for our Prairie Foundation prairies so that so the administrators of iNaturalist from the Missouri Prairie Foundation project can see those, but this is the general public using iNaturalist won't be able to see where those are found.
Thank you. So yes, we're thrilled to have documentation. We'd love to know about species that are on our prairies, but to protect these species, we will be obscuring the locations. Great question, Lynn. Helen asked, what makes the glass lizard a lizard when it looks so much like a snake?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So glass lizards are actually from a family of lizards that has kind of a tendency towards reduced legs. So snakes really, at the end of the day, are just all basically legless lizards. If you go back in evolutionary time, snakes used to have legs, and they're very, very closely related to lizards. So a lot of different lizard species either have really small legs or no legs, like the glass lizard. When you look at the glass lizard, there's a few things that you can tell on a glass lizard that makes it less snake-like than all of our snakes, at least in Missouri. One is it has eyelids, so it can actually blink its eyes like all lizards. Snakes cannot blink their eyes. Their eyelids are basically fused and just like a clear scale over their eyes. They can't blink their eyes. There's a couple other things, and they're escaping me at the moment. One of the things with the glass lizard is that if you actually look at a glass lizard, it is about 2/3 tail, which is opposite of snakes. Most snakes just have a fairly short tail, but if you find a glass lizard, most of it is tail, which also makes it kind of a shorter, stockier body. When it's just the body you're thinking about, then it does seem more lizard-like.
Thank you, Brian. A question on Facebook about I'm just looking for it here, excuse me, about, I think it was the Great Plains snake was the question. Are they rather cryptic?
The Great Plains rat snake?
I think it's gone now from Facebook, but that was the question earlier that I saw. I think was the species.
Okay, by cryptic could mean a couple different things. They're actually, if you're familiar with corn snakes, which are found in Southeast US, they are related to corn snakes. They used to be the same species, but they're gray, and this gray rat snake is another name that's sometimes used for them. I have not found a lot of them in Missouri. I see them every once in a while. They're more commonly found out west in Kansas and Oklahoma and other regions. They look like black rat snakes when they're small. They have blotches on them, so they're a blotched snake. And when they get bigger, that pattern kind of fades and it turns kind of dark and black. In Great Plains rat snakes, they have that same pattern throughout their life. So even when they're large, they still have that blotched look to them. So it makes them really, really distinctive looking.
Thank you, Brian.
I don't know if I answered that question or not, but.
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but that was great information. And I also wanted to mention, Brian, and you can provide or corroborate or provide more information. Missouri is lucky. It has a really great amphibian and reptile field guide of Missouri put out by the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I believe it's currently being revised. But if people want to, learn more about identification, of course, you've listed some great resources here, maybe in terms of field guides. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there's as you mentioned, there was a new Missouri herp book that's in, I don't think it's in press yet. They're still working on it. That'll be coming out soon. But you're right, the editions of the book for Missouri have great photographs in it. The map, since the one I think was released almost 20 years ago, the maps are out of date, but you can go to the Herp Atlas online to see that. And we actually publish an atlas that just has maps in it and nothing else. that you can use to kind of go along with the book and look at the photos. As far as other books that you can use, I'm kind of a fan of the Peterson's Field Guide series. They have both an Eastern and a Western edition. And the Eastern one was updated fairly recently and has pretty good maps in it and pretty good drawings in it and some decent descriptions. And other state guides are also pretty good. The Arkansas State Guide is pretty good. The Kansas State Guide is pretty good. Most of our states, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Oklahoma, all have guides that you can actually also use and see what's going on with them.
Great, thanks. There's several questions about conservation. Are amphibians and reptiles protected species? And I know you did mention about what the Missouri law is about handling amphibians and reptiles, but could you speak a bit about their protections, their sort of protection status? Are there protection statuses for amphibians and reptiles?
Sure. So there are some species of reptiles and amphibians in Missouri that are actually considered game species. These are, I don't know if I can name them all, but I'll try. Bullfrogs and green frogs can both be hunted. Snapping turtles and both of our species of softshells can also be hunted for personal use. Nothing in that list can be hunted for market use or to sell or anything. Other than that, all reptiles and amphibians, as well as all animals that don't have a specific hunting season for them, are just generally protected as non-game species. So that means that you can't just wantonly kill them or anything like that. So it's generally against the wildlife code to kill animals that don't have a hunting season for them. Now, that said, I think that they make an exception for like venomous snake species, which we didn't talk a lot about. If you're in immediate danger or somebody in your family is in immediate danger, that it's not against the law to kill them. But I will say that typically most people who are bitten by a venomous snake, it happens when they're messing with the snake or they're trying to kill it. So the best thing you can do is get it to move along. One of the ways you can do that is if you have a garden hose nearby, you can spray it with a garden hose. If they don't like that, and they'll go off in the other direction. But the best way to prevent venomous snakes from being near your house or near places where your kids are playing or whatever is the opposite of what we answered before, and that is to remove habitat and cover. So if you have a place where they are, and if there is no habitat and cover there, then they're typically not going to come and hang out in that area. So that's the best way to kind of handle those. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent to answer the question, but I think I got it.
That's great. Leah asks, is the Missouri Prairie Foundation or MDC doing anything to save the endangered snakes, such as removing eggs and raising these in captivity? I'm not aware of snakes, but of course, there's a wonderful program on hellbenders with the Conservation Department in the St. Louis Zoo. But on snakes, are you aware of any projects, Brian?
Not in Missouri. Again, a lot of the species that we talked about here that are endangered because they don't have any habitat. So it doesn't do a lot of good to do propagation of an animal if you don't have a place that you can release it. So that's probably the thing that's restricting those kind of programs from going. And obviously, money and time and resources makes it to where you have to pick and choose your battles, of course. In the case of hellbenders, we see that their habitat, a lot of their habitat is actually protected, but they're still disappearing. So that is, I think, one of the reasons that it kind of got a captive breeding program going. Not to mention the fact that they're just really amazing and unique animals, and that's a reason too. But the primary reason for most of the endangered ones I talked about was they don't have habitat to turn them loose into, so there's just not much point in a captive breeding population going.
There's a question from Catherine about, are the 3 snake species that are gone now in Missouri, and I think you had the slide there of the smooth green snake and 2 other ones, are they in other states?
Yes, so those photos were actually taken, I think the one was, it's on there, Let me see if I can get back to it. The smooth green snake was photographed in Illinois, as was the plains garter snake. The Massasauga was actually photographed in Missouri. So the smooth green snake is actually a northern species. So if you go up to our northern states, they're actually more common up there. The plains garter snake is mainly a western species, so it's found further west. The eastern Massasauga, if you consider them two different species, the eastern Massasauga, which I'm pretty sure no longer exists in Missouri at all the populations are completely gone. They exist further east, and it is highly endangered. It only exists in a few places in Missouri, Indiana, maybe Pennsylvania. The prairie Massasauga is actually pretty common when you get out to our western states. So they're all still around.
Thank you. Question, really interesting question from Val. How large an area do turtles frequent? Do they have a territory, or they just meander for life?
So that's a great question. And I'm not sure that anybody knows for sure. I have read in some places that like, let's take box turtles, for example, that there's a certain percentage of box turtles that just kind of wander all over and they really don't have a home territory. But I can tell you from my own work here at my house, actually, that I actually have box turtles that I've marked that I catch year after year after year. So a lot of herp species, but certainly turtles among them, have a home range. They have a place that they know and that they frequent. They know where to get food. They know where to get water. They know how to find mates, and they just kind of live in that small area all the time. And I think in general, you should assume that any herp species, or really any animal species that you find, probably has an area that they've learned and that they hang out in.
Thank you. You talked about having native plants available for amphibians and reptiles. What about water features? What about even a shallow, dug area, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the amphibians that we talked, or actually all the amphibians we talked about today, require that water for part of their life cycle. That's where they mate, lay their eggs, and where their tadpoles live. And a lot of water features in gardens sometimes will have animals like that that use them. You'll hear frogs calling out of them. Sometimes they'll lay eggs in them, and tadpoles will live in them, and that's just, they just incorporate it into part of their life cycle. It's not necessary for everything. So a lot of times you'll have some amphibians that'll come into your area. They have a breeding site nearby, and it's just your area is the place where they spend the rest of their time, basically. The aquatic turtles, of course, need the water, and sometimes they'll take up residence in some of those garden ponds and so forth. I think just in general for any kind of native habitat, I think that most places will say that a water feature of some kind is a desirable thing because it just allows more animals to use your area.
Thanks, Brian. Cheryl has a question. When you showed the Illinois chorus frog, she says it looks similar to what we call, quote, tree frogs here in rural Southwest Missouri, but the map distribution does not show them here. I'm guessing that means our little, quote, tree frogs are not prairie species.
Yeah, so that's one that I didn't cover, but you can actually find tree frogs out on our prairie species around mainly trees. They're pretty tied to tree habitats, but they can be found out in prairies and grasslands. If you're in Southwest Missouri and you have those, there's almost certainly one of the gray tree frog species that's there, and they do look pretty similar. They're in the same family.
Thank you. Daniel has a question. Should we submit records of commonly found herps?
For sure, if you find them on Prairie Foundation land, please do, because we are trying to track what we have there. Elsewhere, you could certainly do that. What I would encourage you to do is go to the Herpetological Atlas site for any species that you find, and you can there's actually some maps on there that show places where the records that we have for them documented are really old. And especially if they're really old, we would like to get updated records in those areas.
Great. What habitat are hognose snakes most often found in?
So hognose snakes tend to be toad predators. So that's their main food source, are toads. So they're going to be places where toads are. And typically toads are found in places where they can dig into the soil, and that's kind of where they hide out. American toads are a little bit different because they seem to be found all over. They're all over the Ozarks, which doesn't have a lot of loose soil to dig into. So hognoses are going to be pretty much all over. Now, that one species I talked about, the dusty hognose snake, is only found in southeast Missouri. At least in Missouri it is. There's also a plains hognose snake that's barely in Missouri, and it's more common out west. The most common species that we have in Missouri is just the eastern hognose, which we didn't talk about today. And they're pretty much found all over. And they're a generalist. They can be found in grasslands. They can be found in forests, lots of different areas.
Thanks. Just a couple more questions here, and I may be mispronouncing this. Any information on the DK's brown snake?
Yeah, DK's brown snakes are just brown snakes, are another garter snake relative. So they're related to garter snakes. A big one is a foot long, maybe a little bit bigger than that. They eat basically slugs and worms, and they are definitely a generalist species. You definitely find them out on grasslands. I didn't cover them because I couldn't cover everything, but you definitely find them in prairie areas, but you also found them all through the Ozarks. Anywhere there are slugs and worms, which is pretty much everywhere.
Just a couple other questions. Edith mentioned a couple years ago, she came across a three-toed box turtle eating a small dead bird. Is it common for them to scavenge dead animals?
Yeah, so I've seen that too. I've seen them on the road eating animals that have been run over on the road before. Three-toed box turtles are mainly herbivores, so they're one of the exceptions to the rule of herps being carnivores. But they're opportunistic. They'll eat anything they come across that could be nutritious for them. As an aside, ornate box turtles are mainly insectivores, so that's a difference between the two species. But both of them will eat, dead animals. There's even a few cases of snakes trying to scavenge dead animals, which is pretty unusual.
Where do snakes like a garter snake spend their winters? Is it possible to build a hibernaculum to encourage them to stay around in your yard?
Yeah, so a lot of it's a mystery. So probably a lot of them spend time down in mammal burrows, which is where a lot of our reptiles and amphibians spend the winter. But there's also a lot of records and observations of them being found down in the interlaced flat rocks in an old well that people dug, or down in cellars. So I think it is possible to do that. I think the important thing to do is somehow they have to be able to get underground to where they're kind of below the freezing line. It's not good enough for most of Missouri, at least, or for most winters, to build something above ground, because it's just going to get too cold and they're not going to be able to stay there. So it's going to have to be something that they can kind of get into. But I think if you had like a brush pile or a habitat like that, what you do is you encourage mammals to come in and use that. And if you have mammals there, then you have a place for the snakes to hibernate as well.
Great, thanks. I think I'm just going to finish up with this last question. Several people had a similar question. A couple people remembered years ago you could buy live turtles at dime stores. And I don't remember this myself in Missouri, but in terms of in Missouri, I guess that was probably box turtles, I'm guessing. Or do you know, Brian, or maybe some kind of aquatic turtle?
Yeah, I don't know. There's several turtles that are in the pet trade. Like I stated before, it's illegal to take wild caught animals and sell them. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And it gets a little bit more difficult to tell what's going on if you catch something here and take it to another state to sell it, or send it overseas to sell it, which happens sometimes. It could have been any number of turtles that could have happened with. And it's still common. You can still go into pet stores now and get especially red-eared sliders, which are really common over most of their range as pets. And it's hard telling where they come from, or you'd like to think that they're captive bred, but I highly doubt it with red-eared sliders. They're probably wild caught, probably illegally is what I would guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to underscore the very serious pressures that we have on our herpetofauna in Missouri. And just because something might seem common, that is not a reason to illegally take an animal. And someone had a question about if you wanted to reintroduce an animal. Is that legal to move an animal from one area to another to kind of, can you talk about that, Brian?
Yeah, I would say it might be a gray area. I would say it's not a great idea though. The reason it's not a great idea is there's a couple of reasons. First of all, like we had talked about before, animals kind of learn where they are and where all their resources are. They know where to get water, they know where to get food, they know where to hide from predators, they know where to find mates. If you pick an animal up and move it to someplace else, it'd be just like taking you and dropping you into a city without telling you what city you're in, without a map or anything, and just expecting you to be able to go to the grocery store and find a place to live and, so forth. It's the same way with herps or any animals. The other reason is that a lot of these animals are really site specific, and it's really unknown exactly what kind of gene flow we have in the state between species. And by that, I mean, how different are snakes of the same species a county away or 2 counties away or a state away. And it's really not real well known, but a lot of the studies that are coming out right now have shown that they're what we call cryptic species and some of these wide ranging common species of herps. In that if you take one from one area, it may actually be a different species than taking it to someplace else. So you just have to be careful of that. So I would say just in general, it's not a good idea.
I lied. We have one more question that I think
okay.
is interesting because other people might experience this. Huge snake, 6 to 8 feet long, living in our basement, have found skins 3-4 in a row. How do I deal with this? Is it safe for my small dogs, cat, me to sleep or otherwise hang out down there?
Yeah, so when you find shed skins, the shed skins are actually larger than the snake itself because they kind of stretch out after they shed that skin. For sure, it's a large snake if the skin is that large. I would guess it's probably a black snake. I don't know what area of the state they're in. That's the most common one I would think that you would normally, that big that you would find in a house or something like that. It's not a danger to your pets that may scare them. As far as finding it, I think that if you maybe put some cover down in your basement, it may use that cover. If you have some stuff in your basement that you can, if you're not comfortable doing it, have somebody come over to your house and kind of search around for it. They may be able to find it and remove it for you. That's probably the best I can say on that.
Well, thanks, Brian, for staying on so long. I hope I've gotten through all of the questions. And I would just like to end by thank you so much for a wonderfully organized presentation with incredible information. And these amphibians and reptiles are an incredibly important part of our natural heritage, and they deserve our respect and our conservation and our protection. Conserving habitat, as Brian said, is extremely important. And we welcome, if you're not familiar with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, go to our website, lowprairie.org. You can learn more about what we do. And tomorrow, Brooke will send an email out with the resources that Brian shared and some others shared. We still have 149 people on, and they're thanking you, Brian, for a wonderful presentation. And again, there will be a link to Brian's presentation available on MPF's YouTube channel. And as Brooke mentioned, we've got other programming coming up. So thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Brian, for preparing and delivering a fantastic presentation.
You bet. Thank you very much.